social and economic justice issues on the internet. Now, the general, not a general proposition, but a proposition has been there that internet governance is something which will take care of this automatically because the internet is structured in a way that makes democracy easier, economic justice, rest of it will take care of itself. It's a kind of techno-optimism that has for a long time been something that people have held. The potential that the internet would bring democracy, the internet would allow people of all kinds to be able to propagate their views, their opinions. It will break the monopoly of the few, and so on. But the reality today is that we also see new monopolies emerge. We are seeing a kind of homogenization of the net by which English is now, I think, about 55 to 57% of the world's websites, while it's only 12.5% of the world's speakers. So you have this kind of disproportionate economic and social power coming into some hands. And I think that's something that we all need to really think about. So this is the genesis of this workshop. I will introduce the speakers who are on the dais. Parminderjit Singh, who is from IT for Change, has been involved on these issues for a long time, and he's also one of the founder members of the JustNet coalition. Then we have Pinder Wong, who has a really illustrious career. He's done a hell of a lot of things. I'm going to give only a few of them. He is one of the internet pioneers, the chairman of Verify in Hong Kong. He's been on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, has been in various capacities in ICANN and IAB, including member of the ICANN board, 1999, and is active currently in web payments community. We have Cristina Gonçalves from the University of São Paulo. She is a part of the research group on public policies for access to information, special advisor to Brazilian Federation of Librarians Associations for copyright and internet issues. And I have Norbert Bollo, who represents the Swiss Open Systems User Group, which is in Switzerland, the leading organization for open source software. So these are my four panelists. I would request Parminder to go first and tell us what he believes are the key issues on the internet regarding social and economic justice.
Thank you, Prabir. Yeah. Before getting into describing what are the key issues, actual issues, and how they pan out, I think the way the workshop has been structured as well is about a problem of there not being an adequate recognition of this area itself in the internet governance space. And we would be using our discussions as a point of departure of trying to go in a new and different direction. We should otherwise be so mainstream in current politics. It is in terms of every political space and polity that social and economic issues are prime. But in this area, because of some of the reasons which Prabir started to allude to, internet governance is strangely divorced from focus on social and, diverse from, even conceptualizing economic and social justice issues. Internet is recognized as kind of a technology which is beneficial. We have it, we can use it, and there's not much to be done other than to manage it. Like if we're living in an apartment, we have electricity connection, we need an electrician to make sure the connection is right and take care of repair, etc., the plumber to do the plumbing, and internet governance is those kind of management issues, and there's not much else to internet governance in its very conception. But what is missed is that internet is causing huge amount of social changes around us. The social structures, the social systems are changing, and the nature of that change corresponds to the nature of the architecture of the internet. And internet governance should now move into these actual social structure changes rather than about the plumbing and electricity connection kind of management issues of the internet. One frequently hears in most of the discussions that human rights should be included in the end, they would say, let's bring in a human rights perspective is kind of a salt that should be mixed to food, kind of a thing. And if you ask most of the groups involved here what those human rights are, they would say, yeah, of course, freedom of expression and maybe some privacy, but they would forget the pages and pages of human rights declaration in the United Nations, at the United Nations and other places, and huge amount of them being social and economic rights, cultural rights, the right to development, which are completely a blind, not a spot, but a blind space in this area. And we should start talking about these things. I would briefly touch 2 or 3 areas just as illustrations. Cultural diversity is so huge an issue as internet goes to the far corners of the world. The inundation of content, which is concentrated in the West in few countries, causes some changes which are not beginning to be even understood and spoken of. There was a UNESCO treaty just a few years back which says that cultural goods are not typical commercial goods, and therefore the WTO regulations do not apply to cultural goods, and which has allowed many countries, France, Canada, but many others, to have quotas of films which could be imported in a year into these countries. But what does that really mean in times of internet where the content flows on a daily, hourly basis with unlimited pipes? Not that I'm taking a position that it should be this way or that, but those kind of issues have not at all been articulated. Second is personal data. We hear a lot of stuff about privacy as a kind of negative right, but I think personal data is also a means of social control and also a personal resource. And there are no formulations around understanding personal data as an economic resource, who's making money, whom does personal data belong to, and if so much money is being made on personal data, what kind of distributional aspects should be captured here. And it is true in the case of what impact internet is having on health, education, etc. And I'll come back to some of these subjects, but the very fact that we need to start formulating a good part of internet governance and the discussions in Internet Governance Forum specifically on these areas is the point of departure which I think this workshop is seeking, and we would look forward to a discussion on this. Thank you, Prabir.
I would next like Pinder Wong to tell us what his views of internet is, and listening to him, I'm sure he's going to be provocative.
Good morning, everyone. Just to clarify that everything I'm about to say is my personal opinion and view, so it's not reflective of any of the institutions that I'm associated with. So I believe that the internet mirrors society, and in some sense mirrors the existing injustices that are already present, but in some instances actually amplifies them. And so my operating question is, or my sort of belief is the following, that technology does impact society. I think that should be self-evident, and that the societal values need to be considered at the beginning of the technical development process and not at the end. So let me give you an example. Yesterday we had, so I'm interested in the development of web payment technology, which is to be able to use the internet to basically route money. The upside for that will be that you can send money like you send email, the cost of doing so being increasingly trending to zero over time, and hopefully that will unleash the new economics and the new kinds of opportunities to access value for the next 1.5 billion people to come online. The same 1.5 billion people are probably also going to be the ones that are so-called the global unbanked. It's not economic for people to necessarily see them as being traditional banking customers. And so what we did yesterday was, before the technical development of the actual protocol itself, is to solicit the views of the people here at the IGF. The private sector views, the civil society views, and the government views. Well, why do we want to do so? Well, as Norbert will say, he has a big thing on spam. Now, the people who invented email, what were they thinking? Couldn't they not have foreseen the consequences of leaving out open relays and what have you? And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid making the same mistake as with email, for the payment, for this web payment network, using in the process of its development. And what this means, quite simply, is that technical considerations can no longer be just about so-called security. And the argument that, well, you cannot, without security, there is no privacy. I think that's somewhat false. Insofar as we know from last year in Snowden, it doesn't take much skill to spy on an open network. Okay, it's open. Some would argue that if you're open, why do you need security? You're open. Okay, so these are the kinds of tensions. So what I see in the technical developments is, if you look at the internet documents, there's in these requests for comments and the technical standards, which is really the root of where a lot of the technical development occurs, there's a line at the very bottom called security considerations. Now, what I believe is the future, and what I would like to propose here, is that in all of the policies that are being developed that help, I hate the word govern, but to help administer the internet, there is a similar RFC structure to mirror the technical. Why is that important? Is because if a document looks completely different from the technical document, you're not going to get engineers to read it. You're not going to get engineers to take interest into it. But in the new policy documents, these new, what I would call RFC policies, or what we hear the last few days called best practices, there's a specific line. And this specific line is human rights consideration. And this is part of a standard document. In other words, any future policies come out must contain a line, human rights consideration. And if we do that one simple thing, this raises the profile, because technology is to serve humanity, I hope. It's slightly different when there's machine to machine, but for now, we are the biggest users of the internet. Now, why is this important? So let me use another example. There are, I play in the sort of angel space, and in, how many of you have a smartphone? Yeah, I don't. Okay, I use a 2G phone. I live on the other side of the digital divide. But for those of you who have a smartphone, in terms of mobile payment, there are, if you look at angellist.com, there's over 800 startup companies developing technologies in mobile payment. You may have heard recently of Amazon Local Register to have a cheap way of accessing credit card on your smartphone, or companies like Square. But your smartphone these days has various types of biometric sensors. Fingerprint scan, right? Or maybe a voice print, or maybe a retinal scan, or what I would also see going forward is the cognitive profiling, which is how fast you touch certain buttons. And that's your private data, but it's captured some way. Now, what were the consequences of doing that? Well, let me share with you an example. There are startup companies that are looking at, for example, attaching a device that monitors how much exercise you do, and adjust your life insurance premium accordingly. So what we're seeing right now, because of globalization, is all this technical innovation, and it makes things very convenient, right? Makes it easy. And I would say that the pathway to hell is made very convenient. That cost of convenience has a consequence. So when you couple all of that biometric information with payment, you may have unforeseen consequences, and we need to consider those social consequences, the justice, the economic justice of that up front. Let me give you another example. In some countries now, to register for a SIM card, they need to take your fingerprint. Now, who made that decision? And where does this information reside? And what happens when that information, the data repository is hacked? So the long and short of it is, the social and economic tensions that existed previously, I would argue, are made worse by the internet. It's not the fact that the change is occurring, it's the fact that the rate of change is going to kill us. Why? Because our societies are not geared to adapting and evolving at the same rate. Now, one can talk about the generational difference between, for example, the way my kids use computers and the way I use computers. The underlying assumption, though, is that should any of this infrastructure go away, like you lose your smartphone, there is an incredible, what I call digital disorientation. So I would say the smartphone's not necessarily smart, because if you lose it, do you lose all your intelligence? So getting back to the point, which is technology development is designed to make things efficient, effective, etc., etc. But we have to clearly, somebody is responsible for thinking about the unintended consequences, the social consequences of the technical development. It's not clear who, and it's not acceptable to leave everything in the hands of the engineers, because we're all society, and they're good at designing protocols. So my concern is the future that we're building for example, our children, will actually be a form of digital slavery, what I call slavery 2.0. A slavery to the technology itself. In other words, should you take that technology away, will they be able to function in an analog world? They make their friends now digitally, sometimes superficially. If we lose power, and I like to use Thailand as an example because my wife's from Thailand. When you become to depend on any infrastructure wholeheartedly, when that goes away, when the payment network goes away, when the electricity goes away, what do? Well, the irony with the internet, because of its so reliability, is that when it goes away, we're not exactly sure what to do. Some of us, I think, we have a special responsibility. Why is this? I think we are the last of the analog digital generation. We're at that cusp. We can remember what it's like that when the power goes out, we bring out the petrol generator. We know what happens when the computer goes down, we move back to the paper ledger. Our children do not have that experience. So when they lose the digital identity or the digital infrastructure, it is incredibly disorientating and incredibly debilitating. So my interest in the panel today is to avoid that. And that's by basically telling them, look, you have to live and not assume that it's there. Don't over-rely on it. That's why I use an analog phone. Because I don't need the latest and greatest. I don't necessarily need to demonstrate that there's any kind of role model. I can function quite happily with voice. So, as I said before, I think the pathway to convenience leads a certain direction, and those responsible for building that path have a social, moral obligation to consider the consequences of their actions. It's not clear to me where that dialogue should occur. I hope it occurs here at the IGF for the unique multi-stakeholder view. And by demonstrating that in yesterday's web payment, I hope that we're not going to make a colossal mistake with the web payment technology that we're doing. So please help us avoid unintended consequences by participating in expressing your views. Thank you very much.
So Pinter has given us also what I will call a bit of techno-pessimism, that technology has amplified the existing social and economic injustice that existed in the world. And I would argue that, that's something we really need to address.
I'm actually an optimist, and the reason why I'm couching this in rather negative terms, I do want to end on a positive note, so one last word if I may. The internet is an entirely human construction. Barring the speed of light or the speed of gossip, which I'm not sure which is faster, there are probably no known constraints. In other words, the problems that we solve and the fact that we're having culture clash, generation clash, technology clash, all rolled into one on a very tight 2 minutes to midnight, the actual solution to these problems, I also believe, is actually in our ability to use the internet to find solutions. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's good that you gave that finishing point, because it's true that if it is going to amplify and we are passive, then there is a serious problem. So obviously what you're also arguing is that if we don't do it right, then it can do the following things. And I think that's a very important point of departure. I will ask Christina now to tell us about her experience and her research, as well as what she feels about these topics.
Hello. Hi. Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation for joining this panel. I'm gonna give you some an overview on the key issues that we are facing now in Brazil regarding the internet, economic and social justice development related to the internet in Brazil. So I highlight some points and give you some data and bring some case that could show how information and communication technologies and internet could help us to develop and where it's not working very well. So the first problem that I would like to point out is access to broadband internet in rural areas. When you look at the general numbers in Brazil, it seems like quite good when we have like 60% of access to internet in Brazil, but when you look at the regions in Brazil, like the provinces that are having this access, we can find like a huge disparity in that. In the north part of Brazil, we can find like only 36% of houses have access to broadband. So I would like to say that access to internet is still an issue in Brazil, despite the fact that you are developing countries that puts itself in the center of internet governance, and you are not facing these issues in public policies. And despite the fact that only 36% of the north part of Brazil has access to internet, you have some heroes there, like the indigenous populations. They are developing great projects, putting their material on the internet. I would like to point out that they are developing a web radio in Amazonas, and also they are developing open educational resource to spread information about their culture. So those are two good examples in how they could use information ICTs for development in these so small and isolated communities like the indigenous people in Brazil. The other point that I'd like to highlight here is the public and free access to internet. Brazil the government just abandoned this politics on telecenters and public access. I started working with libraries in Brazil, and we are trying like to build a working group to train librarians and to convince policymakers to use their space to expand public access to internet. Because when you look at the numbers also, you find that 50% of the low-income population in Brazil doesn't have access to internet, and 68% of this low-income population don't have access to internet or don't have a computer because they don't have a computer. And why they don't have a computer? Like 48% of these people don't have a computer because it is too expensive. So if you provide those people with public access to internet, for example in libraries that already have an infrastructure for that, you can like try to solve this problem. Like almost half part of the low-income population not having access to internet or not having a computer. So the other problem is the software development in Brazil. We are extremely dependent on the developed country software development. We have only 2 companies in Brazil developing free software, and about like 5 companies developing now national software. On the city hall, is that what say city halls? Like and the majors in the city have about 5,506 city halls in Brazil, and only 63 are using free software. So they are again extremely independent on international companies, on developed countries, private companies. So why I'm talking about software, because when we talk about the right to privacy and freedom of expression, it's really important to us to not be so dependent on United States. I know we have been talking here a lot since last year about the Snowden revelations, all the problems with surveillance. So it's also a development issue. The having like national softwares and not being extremely dependent on technology, on NARS technology. So also our technology device and hardware is you have no national production of hardware in Brazil, so it also makes us very dependent. We have some good policies like the CGI.pr policies with internet exchanging points. We have almost 23 internet exchanging points in Brazil, which makes the internet more resilient, faster, and sometimes less expensive, but it doesn't solve the privacy problem. The other problem is the open access to research. We are also very it's like a speech about dependence. Is are very dependent on the scientific publications from European and US based publishing house, and you have like 5 major publishing houses in the world, and they sell these materials to public universities in Brazil, but we don't have most of the times we have to struggle with these publishers in order to have the right to store this research material in our libraries, in our repositories. And if you just not have a contract with these publishers anymore, you just lost all the material that you have already paid. So this is also a problem that we are facing now in Brazil, and try to develop a better policy on open access and copyright. And another issue is the gender issue. I know some statistics says that you look at that and you have like gender balanced, like you have 70% of women having access to internet, while you have 73% of the men having access. So it's quite balanced. But again, when it comes to the development of software engineering and things like that are also important for economic and social justice, we have only 7% of women enroll as a computer engineer in universities in Brazil. So that's a pretty small number. And so what are the solutions? Well, of course, we advocate for more policies on that, but in Brazil, the government always presents like the private-public partnerships as a good solution. The findings are that most of the time there is little civil society participation on those private partnerships, and also they are not very transparent on their results and what are they really doing. I mean, what's the product of those partnerships? So they spend the money that they are spending and things like that. So I will leave like for debate. Like, they have lots of issues, but yeah.
Thank you, Christina, for bringing out the fact that even when the figures don't look so bad, they could hide really sharp disparities within that. So that's, I think, and the need, therefore, for policy interventions in different ways in different areas. I think that's a very important point. That's not enough to look at the numbers, but look at also what's happening behind the numbers. I'd only add one point, that we must consider that for a lot of the developing countries, the access to the internet is not going to take place through the computer, but probably for that thing that Pinder was critical about, the not so smartphone, or the smartphone that makes us not so smart. So I'll hand it over to Norbert to tell us more about these issues, particularly what's happening on payments and other issues which are of vital importance to the world, that section which is not on banking. So how do you really address that? Pinder has already talked about, but Norbert is also passionate about that, and let him do that, and also touch upon open source software.
Thank you. I would actually start by mentioning that Switzerland, even though the Swiss statistics, they look wonderful, actually shares a lot of the problems that Christina has been pointing out, especially in my area of interest, which is software. We are also in this position of dependency. Switzerland does not like to be counted among the developing countries, but really, if we are honest, I mean, we don't have Microsoft, we don't have Google. Well, there is Google, big Google plant, but still the decisions they are made in the US. We don't have control of the software on our computers, except for the relatively few of us who like to use free software on our computers. We have some freedom. We can change the operating system when we like. With the not so smart smartphones, it's a bit more difficult because they try to prevent us from putting the software that we want to put there. So that is the problem. Going back to what started this whole IGF process, the World Summit on Information Society, that actually also started in Switzerland in 2003. We had the first of these two summit events in Geneva, and there was a governmental declaration developed, and as civil society was not quite so happy with the direction that was taking, there was a civil society declaration that very clearly pronounced the very people-centric vision of information societies. So really, since 2003, civil society put out this banner, we want a people-centric thing, the opposite of slavery 2.0. To be honest, not so much has been happening with that. When we read that document again, it has aged very well. It's still a very excellent document. It has a very good section on free software, for example. Free in the sense of freedom. This is not a matter of price. It's a matter of the freedom to be able to change the software to make it do what you want. And that is also important for people who are not programmers, because they will probably know somebody they trust to give them advice. And if it's free software, that trusted friend, that trusted person can give them something that they can trust. And you can never trust a corporation. That simply doesn't work. So in order to have a people-centric society, we really need to move away from this slavery type of software system. It's a whole business ecosystem, and we must move to a system that actually gives people the freedom they need in order to be able to trust whatever they have. Coming back to Switzerland, Switzerland has some advantages. One big advantage is it is a small landlocked country, which means it never had a naval power. It never was tempted to get colonies and make the world mad. It was always small enough that people never got afraid. Nowhere in the world there's a country that is afraid of Switzerland. So this gave us the chance to get a reputation of neutrality, a reputation for pursuing through diplomacy, peace and understanding between societies. And I'm really wondering, maybe we could build on that and take a bit of a leadership role in the world in promoting free software, in promoting a vision of technology that is not greed-based, but that is based on the idea of actually asking the people what their concerns are, very similar to the standardization approach that Pinder has been promoting. So my question to all of you here is, what could be a vision for Switzerland to connect with the rest of the world, to engage in a way that could create some kind of global movement that moves us towards this vision of a people-centric society, a society that is no longer characterized by technologies making injustice worse, but that is where there are useful governance structures actually directed to solving those problems to the extent possible. I would really like to hear from you on this, and also ideas for very concretely applying the international human rights law that we have. We have human rights law on social and economic rights. How to bridge the gap between these wonderful instruments of international law and the practical things that happen. I would admit it's in Switzerland, like probably everywhere else in the world, the programmer does not think about human rights when he is hacking code. There may be a need to create some bridge between that. One idea I really appreciate, the human rights considerations section. Maybe there's more that can be done. I think I'll stop here and listen a bit to how you will react to this question.
Norbert, and with that we have come to the one-way communication that we have had till now. Now we hope to have the other-way communication, that you tell us what are the issues that you think are important in social and economic justice on the internet, and how do you think we can address them. So the floor.
Do we have wireless microphones? Yeah. So let me be the runner. Who wants to go first? Oh, you will do it. If there's no one going to go, anyone?
Prashant is going to go. Prashant, ask a question.
Okay. If nobody's, yeah.
Start the ball rolling.
Okay, I'll start the ball rolling and then do the running. Okay. See, often the debates here is around multi-stakeholder model and all that. But what we have been increasingly seeing, whether it's discussions in various panels or anything, is like the predominance of the corporate sector. You have monopolies in various areas, then issues with software, with things not being open, people are not being able to change anything, prices being so high. So, especially when it comes to the area of internet governance and issues like open access and copyright, where there is people are not able to access, when you look at the developing countries especially. There's a problem with people not being able to access the knowledge online, people not being able to access because of the repositories are held by a few companies. So what is it that we can do to move this dialogue from a, let's say, corporate-centric dialogue to a more, let's say, people-oriented and which should help the society in a better way?
Can I jump in there? In Hong Kong, we are working very hard to try and establish some form of democratic selection. As you know, it's not going so well. But before we learn to vote with our hands. In Hong Kong, we learned first thing is to vote with our feet. And what I mean by that is that the power to determine what you buy is actually with you. And so you can always determine what you install on your machine. But, as I said, it may not be as convenient as some other software. So my point on the pathway to hell is paved with convenience is actually quite a serious one, because it means that we all have to go and have to work and have to improve upon, for example, the open source stuff, so that we can make it more convenient on our terms, so we know exactly what is running. And so the point here being is that what can assist it is always you have the power through your purchases to vote in some way on how you might equalize or help make less disparate the traditional business sector. And I'm not anti-business. Okay, I'm just saying that there needs to be some consideration by society on which trajectory. So open source is great, but if you polish it, the rate at which you polish it, it can be as good, if not better, than others available.
Let's have more questions.
Anya?
I've been volunteered, it seems. I don't have so much a question. I'm just thinking about when it comes to open source. So I have a Windows machine at the moment, and it is actually a dual boot, because before I had this machine, I used Ubuntu for 3 or 4 years. I had to buy a new computer, and nobody got my mouse to work under Ubuntu ever. And there's a whole bunch of luminaries of the open source movement in India and a few abroad who've looked at my machine, but nobody got the mouse to work. I think it's not just, the problem is much bigger than this is just a choice and you can make a different choice, right? It's also about the way hardware is configured. It's a whole ecosystem around it. And part of the reason I think why we're not able to change that is that everything said and done, I'm not convinced that there is enough of a push in the open source movement to really want to become mainstream. I actually meet a lot of techies who also have a real joy in being in their little bubble and being seen as the vanguard of a particular movement and being seen as the most progressive, etc., etc. And I think that also holds us back. I think there isn't enough of an effort to be really user-friendly. So I use, for example, LibreOffice because it's not as advanced maybe as Microsoft Office, but it does all the things I need to do and I understand how it works. So it's, that works for me. It's good enough. I don't need it to be perfect. But I think there are too many things where there isn't just enough communication. And so I think it's a combination of things. We criticize the corporations, but I think also the movements who work on these things, there needs to be more connections with other movements and other groups to actually open this up so that you get a broader movement where it doesn't just become like a culting that's cool, but something really beyond it. And I'm not sure even people in that cult, enough people in that cult do that. Some obviously do. It's just a comment.
More questions?
Can I react?
Hi.
I'm sorry I didn't make this announcement first. Will you please identify yourself before the question? The last questioner was Anya Kovacs. The first questioner was Prashant Sugaran. I'm introducing them because they did not.
Okay. Hi, I'm George Fong from the Internet Society of Australia. Just a couple of comments. Firstly, I'm interested in the open source comment. In Australia, we've had a preponderance of commercial software, and I'm not sure that that's a matter of it being forced on people. It's very hard for us to actually, in the open source world, and we're, in my private capacity as an organisation, we are avid users of open source. We try to promote it, but we're regarded as a little bit as like weirdos in terms of it's not Microsoft. So I think I agree that there is a culture change that needs to take place. A very quiet culture change has taken place at federal government level, and people haven't really taken much notice of it. But the standard for documentation in the Australian government was in fact, obviously doc format, anything that Microsoft put out. They changed that last year, and very quietly they snuck in a recommendation now that all government departments make their documentation standard ODF. Now, it went with a whisper, and the organisation, AGIMO, which is involved with it, has effectively quietly put it out there, knowing that there is going to be a substantial amount of resistance to it. And our understanding is that they're taking a fairly subversive approach, so quietly it'll change that culture over time. We've also tried to promote open source software within community and non-profit organisations, especially in areas where there are low socioeconomic status in places. The problem that we have there is that Microsoft almost always comes to the rescue and says, well, hang on, we'll give you a free or near zero licensing process. So it's actually quite difficult to actually persuade them that maybe an open source server for a non-profit organization is a better idea than having a Microsoft Windows server sitting in the corner. So I think there's a fair amount of structural change that needs to take place in attitudes, and I don't necessarily think that's driven by the corporations. I think there's a culture out there that says that we like Microsoft and it's the only thing we know. Just on a different matter, Pindar raised the issue of what happens if the internet goes away. Well, it did for a town in Victoria in Australia for a few weeks. The exchange in the southwest city of Warrnambool burnt down. It quite literally put the town out of action for 3 to 4 weeks. The financial impact on local businesses there was massive. It ran into the millions, and the social disconnection, it was well documented. There were a few comments, Pindar, that, from older members of the analog generation saying it was really nice to be able to sit down and talk to my kids. But the majority of people felt that the dislocation was significant enough to warrant a major inquiry into why the exchange burnt down, and there are now serious discussions about how we make the net more resilient so that sort of thing doesn't happen. And as far as that's concerned, the local council took a leading role both in the social and economic rebuilding of what occurred. So it was very significant, and Pindar, you're quite right in pointing out that that analog stuff needs to be sort of reflected.
Any other? Louis?
Hello, I'm Louis Pouzin. Just a little point, there are many things we could cover about the insecurity of the internet. But let's say it like a small point. Microsoft is dominant. Microsoft is proprietary. XP is no longer maintained or distributed. My point is any software which is abandoned by the producer should not be covered by copyright for 95 years. It should become automatically open source. And it would be improved by volunteers.
Interesting legal point that if the government should actually do that, otherwise everybody locked into that legacy platform, there's real problems on that.
Can I just jump in there?
We will actually have
okay.
the panel respond. I'm just misusing my power. Any more questions? Okay, so I'm going to throw in one more question. That yes, okay, free and open source software has its problems. Is there something that we need others to do, like governments, to support something which is not proprietary? Should we not have policies like the Australian government talked about? That isn't there for a need for public policy and not just cult figures to promote open source? That's question number one for the panel. The second is, if free and open source is one answer, is that the only answer to the question of social and economic justice on the net? So what are the other things we need to do? Who needs to do them? Can the panel address that? So I will go in the reverse order as I started for the response. I will start with Norbert first, then Christiana, then Pindar, and give the last word to Parminder. Apart from, of course, the chairperson, moderator.
Okay, there were so many things said and asked that I would have liked to comment on. It will be difficult to remember them all. I will start with Anya's comment and ask a question back. Yes, but how? In our group, in our community, there have been quite a few attempts to convince other civil society groupings to try and join forces in some way, not only by trying to convince them to use free and open source software because it's somehow more civil society ideology compatible, but there have been lots of ideas and it hasn't really worked so well. So we are quite interested in ideas that will work for this. I would comment a bit on the idea that maybe the governments should do something. And this is actually very much related to the broader question of society, because in a democratic society, at least in the ideal, there will be a public discourse that informs the actions that governments take. We all know that the concrete, practical, existing implementations of democracy are not quite that totally based on the public discourse. They are to a significant extent based on lobbying. The companies that have a lot of money, and that is typically the companies that have some kind of lock-in, some monopoly position, they milk that monopoly to get money, and then they use that money to lobby the government so that the government cannot do anything that would endanger their monopoly. This is this kind of vicious cycle. So one thing that has been done in Switzerland is to create some serious lobby work. There is, since a few years, a parliamentary group on digital sustainability. It's an official parliamentary group of the Swiss Parliament. All of the major political parties have some members of parliament who participate in that group, and they regularly make interventions in parliament to promote open standards and open source and all that. Also privacy and a lot of other good topics come out of that group. So that is one way to try to bring this whole kind of concerns into a mainstream political debate. Another issue is that if we hear about open source simply not being user-friendly enough, I think we need to recognize that making something user-friendly takes a very significant investment. It is relatively easy for a programmer to hack together a bit of code that does what he wants it to do, as long as the person using it knows exactly what happens inside. It's not so easy to remove those assumptions. It takes investment. One way to get that investment is actually for governments or really any large customer to say, we want something that has good usability and that is free software. There's no reason why that cannot be said, and if the demand is there, then producers will be there. Put out public procurement for a system which has this and this and this properties, which must include usability, which must include a free license. And if you do that, what will happen is you will not only get software, but you will also get local competence. Because if it's free software, suddenly it will not only be the big international technology companies who have the competence to deliver and develop and improve such a solution, it will also be local companies. When you create local demand, for example, by means of a government policy of procuring such a thing, then you also create local competence. I think it's a pretty promising development strategy, not only for this kind of developing country where I come from, Switzerland, but also for the more traditional type of developing country.
We don't like Switzerland suddenly becoming a developing country, particularly after what you've done to the banking industry for the last 100 years. But we'll let that pass.
I wish the...
Is that working? Okay. On the question about policies and what could be done, I mean, on what could be done, I think we have so many layers of actions. You have like the law reform, so we could work for copyright law reform in the national, international forums. Because in Brazil, software is not protected by copyrights; it's patent. We could have like fight for more public policy, so it's connected to our relationship with governments and how we are going to pressure them, and how democratic institutions really functions in the country. So what are the channels for participation and influencing those public policies? In Brazil, we have the Labour Party, which is kind of open for forums for inviting the civil society and experts to develop more public policies, but they're just mostly are more consultation forums. So this layer of public policies is possible, but we also have to take into account the fact that as you said, you have lots of lobbying and pressure from developed countries, from governments, and from the public sector. So we try to implement a policy of free software use in public administration, and then the Microsoft just pressure politicians and they abandon this policy. So yes, sometimes you cannot confront these companies. And the other layer could be the training and to overcome the digital literacy problem, and that's also related to how to make people more engaged in coding and more and get close to the free software logic and the spirit of that. I don't agree very much. They are not very user friendly. I mean, I know in general terms they are not, but they have improved a lot in the last years. Like you have Ubuntu, you have Mint, you have so many user interface that are helping us to use more free software. So yes, it's hard. Technology is hard. All this internet governance is difficult. Requires lots of technological knowledge, but I pretty much agree. You need to do more training. But sometimes we do not have the human resource, neither the economical resource to do that. So that's the other layer that I'd like to talk about. Is like the activist layer. I mean, if you are a free software activist, if you are a user, just talk to your friends, to your family, to the ones that are close to you. I did a lot of that in Brazil, and I have lots of people that now are using free software, and they are free software activists, just because as in the individual level we can do lots of things also. And yeah, I think that was that. Thank you.
How many of you remember a program called WP5? WordPerfect 5. So you had money. Louis raises a very important point, which is, for example, the expiry of XP. And so I make two observations. Should we lose those platforms, we're actually losing access to a lot of our heritage, because we lose access to the computing systems that capture that information at that point in time. And so I think the suggestion of looking at how proprietary software falls into the public domain needs to have some serious consideration. And so I would look at shortening the period of copyright from the 50 years, which is where it is in many countries, to a period of 5 years. Why? Because I've got nothing against Microsoft. I think they write some great software, they innovate, and that innovation needs to be rewarded. But the time that they have to, I talked about the rate before, which is the rate of innovation. 5 years software is a long time in the software industry, and their ability to monetize that probably is going to be maximally 80% or something like that in the first 5 years. Why? Because of the rate of change. And so I think one of the root problems is the length of the copyright period, which in theory, after the copyright expires, things should fall into the public domain. If you have a construct where it's 50 years, well, 50 years we were probably doing things with vacuum tubes, right? So you cast 50 years ahead with the technology cycle on mobile. The reason for also being very focused on open source is to be able to access to those content that were developed at the time. So copyright and the period of duration of copyright, I think, is one thing that has to be seriously looked at. Having said that, I believe in peaceful coexistence. So this is my laptop. It's Zen, it's a hypervisor in which I run a Windows virtual machine together with 5 other machines, one running Ubuntu, what have you. So they can coexist. And that polish you talk about, that's a lot of work, and that does need to be rewarded. But the question is, after the period that you reward, and you've invested your infrastructure on it, and that platform goes away, like an XP, that's a social consequence. That's a huge social cost. So what does this mean? It means that the problem is with the accountants. Okay? I think we need to really seriously look at how we align incentives by changing the way we keep score. If we purely value things in the well-known monetary terms, and if we always boil things in monetary terms, we're missing most of the problem. Let me give you an example. If you had to pay an hourly wage or rate for the time that your mother spent raising you, how much is that worth to society? So I believe that a creative accounting and looking at the ways that we change how we measure the societal contributions does need to be looked at. Let me give you another example. I helped introduce Creative Commons to Hong Kong. And we've been trying to introduce copyright exchanges to legally license copyright instead of ripping people off. The interesting thing is, going back to the payment issue, the cost of routing money. Why? Because again, if you're trying to license a photograph for 50 cents, you may take you $20 to route the money. So that's why I'm interested in the payments aspect. But the accounting aspect, the United States last June changed to a new accounting measure by the UN that has an alternative measure for the value of intangibles, these intangible assets. And their GDP numbers went up by equivalently of a small country in Europe. That's purely by the change in how to keep score. So I think the creative aspect is, how do you align interests for societal interests, maintaining the commercial interest in innovation, but rewarding both. And I think that it really is an accounting issue. And society can decide how we reward that. And the recent example is the measurement of the value of intangibles. The other reason why this is important is, what do we trade on the internet? We trade information goods, virtual goods, right? Digital content, and that's owned by somebody by nature of copyright. And so we have a fundamental economic interest, because unlike the analog world, the digital world, effectively, we have an unlimited resource. We're limited by our creativity, whereas the physical world, we are limited by our access to natural resources. So if digital economies and developed economies like Switzerland can continue to grow, they must find a way to measure the production and sale of intangible goods, because that can also continue beyond their access to resources. So fundamentally, how we measure the societal, these intangible contributions, what I would largely call an accounting issue, is how I believe the key to aligning societal interests and corporate interests. Thank you.
The interesting issue that we actually treat the tangible resources, the common resources like air, water, and so on, as if they're infinite, while we'll treat the digital world, which is infinitely capable of reproducing itself, as if it is finite. So we have this fundamental dichotomy, and that's really created by property. So that's where it comes from. I will ask Parminder to now give us his views on the topic, after having heard all the questions and the participants. He almost gets the last word apart from me.
There's a huge amount of time we're going to leave to the moderator today. Yes, I mean, I'm thinking of the questions, and I remember the top ones, and I'll try to respond to them. And I mean, Prashant was talking about how to move away from a business-centered dialogue in the internet governance space. And many of the discussions later on, including the last one of Pinder, about we should evaluate things in a different manner, but that being recognized as a need, but who can do it are the highest political systems which can only do that kind of a thing. And it's important to see that the last about 10 years of the internet governance dialogue has coincided with a huge amount of the lost paradise of the internet period, when consolidation and centralization of the internet has taken place. And if we try to analyze how the dialogue took place in the IGF and many other places, and the consolidation of the internet, and they're very, kind of lessons you learn about how that dialogue is divorced from what is a problem going on outside, and how little that dialogue is about that consolidation on the internet governance app, and how much that dialogue is inward looking about multi-stakeholderism, which has allowed businesses to come in and make the whole discussion driven by business interests, and keeping away issues which could otherwise trample on the consolidation of the internet power by those very businesses. And when you capture the discourse, you have captured the most vital layer of the whole political activity. And we heard Christina talk about localizations, various kinds of localizations, and Norbert talk about the benefits of social economic benefits of those localizations, but how easily localization can be made to look like fragmentation of the internet. And then, no, you can't do that. And obviously there are slogans and banners out there that you're trying to fragmentize the digital ecosystem or internet, which is its central artifact. And therefore this capture of discourse, and it's greatly directed towards the interest of those few digital corporations who are consolidating on the internet. And we need, if as a single most important imperative, to move away from this business-dominated discourse to a public interest-dominated discourse, where people who come into a dialogue are basically thinking not about their own interest, which is the stakeholder theory, but about a higher public interest. We all know it's not easy to capture what public interest is, and the whole political system exists to figure that out, but at least you step in for the purpose of public interest and not private interest. And without that happening, we're not going anywhere. Second question I remember was Anya's about using free open source software and the responsibility of the community. And I think the allocation of roles to the actors have to be considered in some depth. I think the role of whatever is called community or people or activists in general are to create alternatives and push policies and make structural changes, and the structural changes are made by the governments and the political systems. And it's very difficult to put the responsibility on the movement for failing to do this or that, though when we are internally sitting as activists, we can do those discussions. But there's a limited capacity which a movement has to build the technostructures of this world. We cannot be thinking that it's the health activists who should be producing good medical practices and should be monitoring health practices and so on. They can make models, but finally it goes to the policy area. And the talk we have had about ODF and the Microsoft doc, and a simple, I really see as the biggest failing of policy that in the last 15 years, no policymakers, not in India at least, and most developing countries I know, could enforce a simple thing on Microsoft, that you have a .odf reader, which is the simplest thing, a simplest policy enforcement. You have a ODF reader. We are not even asking to go any further, but if somebody gets an ODF document, he should be able to open it on that system. This simplest policy thing has not happened, and because of that, I could say that the percentage of people who would have liked to use Ubuntu and other Linux systems would have shifted 10-20%, because I know a lot of people whose main problem is that, okay, when I send documents out in ODF, the other guy is not able to read it, and how long can I keep on sending documents in the ODF? The very simple policy things have not been possible because Microsoft has been able to work its way into the corridors of power and controls the policy making. And what multi-stakeholderism has been doing is to give them more and more access. worse than in Microsoft era, in the networking era. We all know it's Google, which is the Microsoft plus of the networked space. That earlier, at least the civil society was very blunt in saying what Microsoft is about. But if you go around in IG spaces today, including in the IGF, Google has so well used the multi-stakeholder principle, method, practices, spaces, that it blunts the civil society's actions and pronouncements of what needs to be said, and therefore we enter a world of new normal where we have started to accept very unequal systems. And again, I would say that the biggest thing needs to be done is to give a pushback to the people who are responsible for big concentrations on the internet and distortions of the internet, and get business out of major public policy discussions and dialogues, other than listening to them as the information which they have to provide. But this dialogue should be a public interest dialogue for us to move forward.
I'm not going to give a long, use up all the remaining minutes. I'll just finish very quickly. Anya, you want to ask something? Go ahead. Okay. You have time for the response.
Anya from the Internet Democracy Project in India. I completely take Parminder's point that there are a whole lot of stuff that could be done on the policy level when it comes to open source. And I also, the person from Australia was talking about how much of a difference it can make if there is a lot of government uptake. We've also seen that in parts of India, so I think those are really important things. I was earlier responding, though, to this idea that we have a choice. I chose open source. But if I would have stuck to that, my computer would still not be doing anything, or I would not be able to use it. So that was my point, that we make it seem as if it's just a choice, and actually that's not true. And if somebody like me, who has so many contacts among techies and people who are part of that movement and who are willing to spend some time to just look at my computer and don't ask payment for it, doesn't get it to work, what does that mean for the average person? So I think just the way things are at the moment, we shouldn't overestimate what we can do there, because it isn't working seamlessly enough for the average person. It is not a real choice at the moment. That's the point I wanted to make.
I don't think that. No, I'm just saying that I think that's a point which I think Norbert has also addressed, that essentially to make it user-friendly, make it seamless, there is a need for investment. And unless public policy changes, and there are ways to channel investment, it's difficult for geeks to really solve the problems of the world. And that's, I think, a given. So it's really the ecosystem which we need to address in a larger way. I'm going to...
Yeah, may I say something just there? Why not we start to develop like open hardware? Maybe that could be a good policy to help this problem. Yeah, it's an idea.
Let's also address the other problem, that unfortunately proprietary software is tied to proprietary hardware, and that's what also creates a lot of problems. But I will really not address the specific issues. I'll only say that what the discussion has said has thrown up the following needs, if I may say so. That one is that you need national policies to support free and open source initiatives. I think that's something that is clear, but they're at the national level, because governments can do that. It's not at the international level. Internationally we can push for this, but it's really at the national level that we can do it. We had a big international battle on the document format. Unfortunately it became 50-50, so we won't go into that, but really it's a national battle that we need to fight. Similarly, when you talk about how the internet has to have justice built into it, what Pinder was talking about, Norbert talked about it, that techies have to be addressing issues of justice when they do the code. If you really take that into consideration, again, issues, for instance, net neutrality, which really address some of the issues that are coming out, that you should not be able to use the net unfairly. Again, they are national issues, in the sense that all the countries today have laws which deal with these issues, or regulatory system which deals with these issues, and we need therefore to really fight at that level. The last point, and I think to me that's a very important point that we need to also address, that originally internet was supposed to be connecting the edges. Now if you connect the edges, then each edge comes under some national jurisdiction, and therefore you can control them. Today, as the internet center of gravity seems to be shifting to YouTube, to Facebook, to various other platforms which are there, and finally the cloud, what is happening is very clearly that all the major cloud or internet's big companies are essentially from one country, and which is the United States. If it is from one country, then only regulation that applies on it, only laws that applied on it are then the United States laws, no other laws. And one of the consequences when you come to things like mass surveillance is 4% of the world may have the Fourth Amendment protection, but 96% of the world does not. So I think these are the issues which demand, if the center of gravity of the internet moves to the middle space, as it were, which is controlled by the United States, unless you have international treaties, international regulations, I don't think we can curb either the police power, the security power of the United States on the net, or we can curb the monopolies on the net through regulation, which you can do nationally. I don't think we can do it internationally, particularly as the US policy today is monopoly is not too bad. As long as it helps the American economy, they're really not going to address it. So I think we need, both from the point of view of mass surveillance, which has been at least a big issue with the Snowden revelations, but also for economic reasons, we need to think how internationally we can address the monopoly power of certain companies through international regulations, if you will, and therefore the need for international treaties, not only taxation, which is being discussed, but also the monopoly power of the companies. Net, for instance, we talk of net neutrality. What about platform neutrality? What about neutrality of ranking that Google provides, by which it can make one company much more profitable than the other, and that company could be its subsidiary? So these are the things we need to think about, how to do it. And I think there is a huge policy space for global issues which we still have to tap with the new emerging architecture of the internet that we are seeing. And of course, we have already the issues like open hardware have been flagged, legacy software, and I really think the 5-year pop art for software, copyright issues have been flagged, and it's not 50 years, Pinder, it varies from 50 to 105 years. So it's really all those issues we need to address. Thank you very much for coming here. We have thanks to all of you for listening so patiently to all the speakers and also asking questions. Thank you.